Rip is in his 9th year at the Kresge Foundation. Is that right? Yes. And he was the head of the McKnight Foundation in the Twin Cities before that, and has had an illustrious cross-sector career. And I've had the chance to work with him over the last 7 years when I was at Living Cities, and then now working as a consultant with Kresge. So the first question we thought we'd ask is to invite you to describe the Kresge Foundation's overall purpose and how this purpose came into focus.
Before I do, it was so interesting to look at the bios of the folks in this room and to read the description of this session that you're going to be walking through. As I said to Lois, this is sort of not our grandmother's environmental gathering. This is just phenomenal cross-section of experience and talent and perspective that I think is, for someone like me who has been in the environmental field for the better part of 25 years, just really inspiring. So before I say anything at all about Kresge, I just want to thank you all for taking the time and more importantly, doing the work you do. I actually think this represents the kind of forward look into what we really need as a society, the kinds of coalitions, the kinds of subject matter interdisciplinary work that you guys are doing that is going to redefine how well we actually come at these questions. So in many ways, kind of Kresge meets you where you are already working. We've, for the better part of a quarter century, we focused on a fairly narrow band of work, which was to invest in buildings. And there was a lot to be said for buildings. You could do green buildings, you could do buildings that were innovative in one way or another. But 7 or 8 years ago, we came to the belief that we had to try to figure out what were the sort of the core values of philanthropy that we could actually bring to the work that might actually add value to a human services field or to an environmental field or to a health field or to a community development field. And over the last number of years, what we've evolved is what we call an urban opportunity framework, which is that we ought to have a North Star of advancing low-income opportunity in cities against which all of our programs are aligned. And I think for folks in this room, that probably sounds so basic. I mean, if you're not working on low-income opportunity and you're not working in disinvested communities, sort of what's the point if you're a philanthropy that's privately endowed and has the discretion to do that sort of work? But for us, it was a big shift. Maybe to sort of jump into a question you haven't asked, Marian, it made for a really interesting portfolio of work at Kresge, because you had a human services team that was focused all day, all week on low-income opportunity and trying to create the supports that people need in order to connect to pathways of opportunity. Similarly, with our health team, we were looking at the disparities that come out of where people live or their life circumstance. But for the environment team, we really sort of sat sort of on the shoulder of that work. Lois had come to us from the Mott Foundation, as many of you may know, where she had structured a really sophisticated and thoughtful program. And so I thought, well, maybe what we need to do is just sort of migrate Mott south to Kresge. And sure enough, Lois set up a very thoughtful early program having to do with renewables, with water quality in the upper Midwest, all sorts of things that we might want to look at. But as we increasingly brought into clearer view this notion of urban opportunity, low-income opportunity in cities, Lois asked the question, we all asked the question, of whether it might not make sense to sort of step back, take another look at the environment program, and not sort of step away necessarily from the good work that we had been doing on mitigation and doing on adaptation, but to try to understand whether there wasn't a way to put low-income opportunity sort of front and center in the program. So Lois and Jessica and others on the team spent the better part of a year working with our board. We actually set up a specific work group to work with the staff. And they developed the program as we currently know it. And in many ways, what seems so basic in this room for us was a very unnatural act, was to take a program that in many ways was a little bit technical, focused largely on mitigation, largely on lots of different dimensions of adaptation, and really sort of zero it in on the kinds of complex, cross-disciplinary work that you all are doing in order to truly give voice to low-income people in determining the future of their worlds, of your worlds, of all of our worlds in a climate induced environment. And so it was it was a big pivot for Lois, and I think the fact that you are all here and engaged in the kinds of conversations you are sort of reinforces my sense that it was a pivot that we really needed to make.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the consequences of that pivot, do you think, for the roles you can play or roles that you will play?
One, I think, is the inherently deeply complex interdisciplinary nature of what we do. If you're focused largely on technical solutions in the environmental field, you can sort of work alone. And I think some really good work is being done all across the country through that channel. But I think at the end of the day, if you're trying to understand how a community or a set of communities can sort of reposition themselves to face the future in a very different way, both to mitigate the effects of climate change and to adapt to them, you've got to sort of throw into the pot all of the kinds of things you guys are talking about. Transit policy, health policy, community development policy, land use policy. I mean, it's very complicated stuff. And having, as you mentioned, Marian, having come out of the community development world, where I think the community development field really struggles with this question. We can pay lip service to it, but these are very different systems. They're very different bodies of expertise. They're very different political constituencies often. And so I think for our team to actually really try to get its hands around what does it mean to mix and match and integrate these different systems in a way that has enduring impact, I think is a huge challenge. I think the other is it's sort of the sister question of working across sectors. And again, it's really tempting, and Lois and I have had long talks about the complexities of this. It's really tempting to sort of work in a philanthropic zone. We give grants, we make loans, we convene, we commission research, and we hope that somehow in all of that we land on some points that really move the needle on big issues. But at the end of the day, unless you sort of fully embrace issues of market forces, unless you fully embrace issues of public policy, and unless you fully embrace issues of nonprofit capacity, the other sectors, you really are working in a vacuum.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the range of roles that you hope philanthropy can play on such complex issues, and maybe particularly on climate.
Big question. Can I back into it a little bit?
Absolutely.
This is probably old hat to many of you, but I think sometimes we forget that there are a number of qualities that philanthropy possesses in different measures and different circumstances, but when combined, give it a really unusual perch. I mean, one is the ability to sort of step back and see things whole. It's an enormous privilege when you think about it. It's almost like being an academic. You can kind of stand back, look for the connections among things, try to sort of arc toward a different kind of horizon line, have the kind of patient capital you need to get there. That in and of itself can be paralyzing. I mean, you can end up admiring problems till they've sort of moved by you. But it is a quality that is I think, important in the sense that it forces philanthropy to really try to be much more integrative in its approach, to try to understand how things do connect that may not, on the surface of things, seem to be connected. Second, we have this extraordinary ability to take risks. It's almost like being social venture capital. And when you think of philanthropy being able to help sort of stay a step or two ahead of where markets are, or pave the way for markets to move into spaces that they've not traditionally been comfortable in, that risk-taking ability is huge. Third, philanthropy has this broad cross-spectrum of tools it can use. I mean, to be sure, we make grants, but we can also convene, we can also commission research, we can also make loans, we can make equity investments. There are, I mean, a lot of ways in which philanthropy's toolbox is extraordinarily broad in a way that the other sectors are. And fourth, and probably most importantly, we can focus on folks who have traditionally been left out of the economic and social mainstream. Each one of those things is not particularly profound, but when you combine them, it actually becomes a remarkable sort of suite of qualities that I think philanthropy makes sure that philanthropy sort of stand in a sort of a unique social position. I've often thought of philanthropy not as part of the nonprofit sector per se, but almost its own sector, because it can kind of mix and match. When it takes a long-term view, it's kind of like acting a little bit like the academic sector. When it's investing its capital, it's working a little bit like the private sector. When it's using all of these tools, it's looking a little bit more like the public sector. And when it's sort of focusing on low-income opportunity, it's really behaving much the way the nonprofit sector does. And so I think one of the challenges philanthropy has is trying to understand in what circumstances, what is the combination of those qualities and those potential approaches that help unlock problems in a way that perhaps a single sector couldn't. And we're blessed in America to have philanthropy of all different sizes and configurations that take different pieces of those questions and put them back together differently. But it is I think particularly for a large privately endowed philanthropy like Kresge, it's a huge privilege to be able to sort of move on all of those fronts simultaneously.
Thanking Rip for being with us. Thank you.